Well, I have to say I'm really, really pleased to be here, and I think I'm going to do the Mutual Appreciation Society thing here because, you know, I really think Marlene's done a fantastic job, and I'm sure you'll all agree. And I'm just, again, well, I'm in awe of you, Marlene. So there you go. We can just mutually adore each other, can't we, for an hour or so, and then we'll all be happy. So I'm going to just pour myself a drink here because I've got a bit of a dry throat. A Guide to Knitting Smoke. The reason I chose this is partly because it's actually a quote from Harry Potter, Prisoner of Azkaban, if you want to find it out. And mostly, though, because this is what it feels like, I think, sometimes, to be doing qualitative research, but particularly to be doing metasynthesis. See if I can turn this around a bit so I can talk to you while I'm doing this. And it's a fairly new discipline, as I'm sure any of you that become engaged in it know. Metasynthesis. And so I think partly what I'm going to be doing with you today is exploring. I'm not going to be coming up with anything definitive, particularly because there isn't anything definitive, but exploring where this whole idea of metasynthesis is at the moment and where it's come from. And see if we can, if there's time, have some questions either formally or afterwards in debate about where we go with this, if we want to go anywhere with it. I think the first thing to say, really, is that there's a dispute about whether it should be done at all. So if any of you have engaged with this whole idea of bringing together qualitative research, you'll probably recognise a quote like this. This is from Marguerite Sandalowski, who's one of the main writers in this area, who does do metasynthesis. But she's obviously, at least in '97, was arguing that there's a risk in doing it, that we end up just using a kind of reductionism, reducing qualitative data to something that is almost like quantitative hard data. And she certainly cautions against that kind of thing. But the counter-argument to that approach, which says it should never be tried because it destroys the whole underpinning philosophy of qualitative research, or at least of constructivist research, is this one from Silverman, which is basically if we don't do it, if we continue to keep doing the same qualitative research over and over again and never try and make some synthesis of it, then we're never going to be taken seriously. And not, quite apart from that, it's never going to make a difference to practice, which is probably more important than being taken seriously by the academic world. And Statham talks about this analytic interruptus concept, which again is this idea that, you know, if we don't get on with it and come to some kind of conception, if you like, then again we're going to continue to be marginalised. It's going to continue to not make a difference. So Fingal has written a very useful paper which summarises, at least in 2003, the main issues underpinning where we've got to with metasynthesis, and summarises it with this quote here. So it's an attempt to create an overarching synoptic which is bringing together claims on the basis of various analytic and synthetic strategies applied to existing qualitative research. That's one. There are a number of summaries, but I think that's quite a good one, just to kind of root where we are. And as you'll see, this is branched into many different areas, but I think that's certainly where it's begun. So just to go through the history of it, as far as we can tell, this is a paper that Dennis and I had published in Jan a couple of years ago. Probably around the 80s that the term was first coined, but really the main architect, if you like, have been Noblet and Hare. And again, any of you who have engaged in this will have, I presume, have come across Noblet and Hare's meta-ethnography. Although it was a meta-ethnography, that is bringing together ethnographic studies, the methods they use are actually very applicable. Interestingly, in a paper I'm going to talk to you about in a bit, a recent paper, a 2004 paper, which brought together a number of the current people working in metasynthesis, Noblet is very modest about their contribution. I mean, he basically says, well, we were just mucking about, really. You know, we were just trying to find a way through all this, and we didn't really ever anticipate that it would end up becoming a kind of a framework for people to use. But that is what's ended up happening, obviously. As we just said, it's about integrating results, and actually that's interesting. Integrating results. That's part of a debate that is had. Is it about integrating the findings of other researchers, or is it about going back to the original raw data and integrating the data across studies? And that's currently up for debate. It's interpretive, that's the idea. It's not about aggregating, it's about interpreting. And so it's never completely finished, it's always on its way, really. And it's usually explicitly iterative. So whereas, and I don't know how many of you have done meta-analysis or Cochrane reviews, but those of you who have will know, and having done this I speak from experience, that they look very precise. They look as if the hypothesis was set, and then the search strategy, and then you did the search strategy, and you never went back to the earlier steps. In fact, that's you do, you know. So although it looks like it's not iterative on the page, it actually is an iterative exercise. Metasynthesis, though, is explicitly iterative. It acknowledges the fact that it's always bouncing around between design, findings, going back to the design, going back to the findings the whole time. So it's much more honest, I think, in that respect than meta-analysis tends to be. And we've said it's about opening up spaces for debate. So again, it's not about coming necessarily to a definitive conclusion. It's about, as you'll see later on, one of the other researchers in this area has talked about reducing uncertainty. So it is about coming to a point where we weren't before, but it's not necessarily about coming to the definitive point at the end of the day. It's about refining our understanding. So this is the paper I was talking about, the paper that in 2004 by Thorne and colleagues, which brought together 3 or 4, I think, of the key researchers in this area, Louise Jensen being one of them. Now, Louise Jensen, her work tends to be fairly structured, analytic, much closer to meta-analysis than some of the other writers are. And she has talked about using various tools and techniques for rigour. So she's quite keen on the idea of being rigorous, which I certainly don't disagree with. But her kind of bent, if you like, is towards the rigour of it. And as I've said, she talks about reducing uncertainty. Noblet, in this paper, and he also speaks on behalf of Hare. I mean, Hare isn't an author of the paper, but he says that what he's talking about is also shared by Hare, the original author, with him. And they talk about these 3 moves. So interpretation, not data. So they're definitely in the camp of metasynthesis is an interpretation of interpretations. It's an interpretation of the original researchers' interpretations, not going back to the original data. This isn't a line that we take, I have to say, but that's the line that they take. That you're generally looking for metaphors, that what you're trying to find is metaphors that explain. Now, I mean, one of the metaphors that bounces around so much in maternity that it's become almost meaningless is the idea of the conveyor belt, for example. Now, the conveyor belt metaphor is actually very powerful, but we use it so much it's become almost meaningless. So part of what this is about is finding powerful metaphors that become kind of psychically or psychologically powerful to people, and that then becomes something that's translated into practice. And they also make the point that social explanation is translation, and that's obviously fundamental to constructivist ways of seeing the world. That in doing the interpretation or in doing the explanation, in doing the translation, we create a kind of explanation which is then taken forward. So the act of doing it creates reality, is what I'm saying. Then the next author in this area, this is still Noblet. This diagram, by the way, is a bifurcation diagram, if anybody's interested, from complexity theory. I can talk to you about that later if you want. But they use these techniques that we use, and a lot of other people do use as well, of reciprocal, refutational, and line of argument synthesis. And it's actually quite grounded theory in its approach. So really what it's saying is you first of all find out how things fit together. That's the reciprocal side of it. So if you've got a range of studies, you say, well, how do the metaphors and the phrases and the findings that are across these studies come together and are similar? And then you go for something like disconfirming data, which is a refutation. Then you say, okay, how do they not? How much does my theory not explain about these data? Having said that, there's another interpretation of this idea of reciprocal and refutational, which is that another way of approaching it, I've not seen this done actually, but certainly it's in Noblet, that it's about the studies you select rather than the content of the studies. So you select studies to be reciprocal, that they are likely to be similar, or you select studies to be refutational, and then you look at how you make synthesis out of those. So it can either be at the level of the study selection or at the level of what's in the studies that you turn up as a result of a topic search. And then the last thing, which again is not very often done, refutation is not often done, and line of argument synthesis is not often done. And Sandalowski feels very strongly about this, as you'll see later, that what you often find in metasynthesis these days is a thematic analysis. So people see how the studies all fit together, and they give you the themes, but they never actually look for disconfirming data, and they certainly don't come up with a synthesis. And those things are really critiqued quite heavily by these authors. So if you're planning to do a metasynthesis, I think it's really worth bearing that in mind. As Noblet himself says, reciprocal is what you see mostly, refutational hardly ever. And the reason I've used this diagram here is because Noblet talks about metasynthesis as a science of becoming, and that's what complexity theory talks about. That you'll never, ever arrive, but you're increasingly becoming more of this pattern that you can see here as you progress further on. The other thing that Noblet talks about quite, and I think this is important, and I must admit we haven't done this, and I think we should begin to do so, and as you'll see later, some of the more recent theorists are doing this, which is understanding the contexts. And again, there's been a debate within RCTs, I think, increasingly, hasn't there? Why is it that the reviews don't ever translate into practice? And one of the classic ones of these is Ellen Hodnett's work on support in labour, one of the things we've always held on to as being really evidence-based is that if you've got support in labour, you get better outcomes, because Ellen's review showed that. When Ellen tried to do it in practice, in a big study, more than 3,000 women across America and Canada, with support in labour, absolutely no difference in outcome. And what she attributes that to is what she calls a toxic environment, that actually, you're trying to impose it, and the studies tend to be done in environments that are accepting of the work. Translating it is much more difficult. So what Noblet is saying is that we really need to understand the context in which the work is done to be able to understand whether it's translatable or not into our own environments, and how. And as I say, we'll come later on to what's called realist review or critical realist research, because that does do that very, very explicitly. The idea of incorporating reflexivity, now Kearney in the same 2004 paper is quite big on the idea of reflexivity, as are we, because we being Dennis and I, because we feel very strongly this is important. And again, this comes back to the idea of a grounded theory approach. Now I know in grounded theory, well, the idea is that you are supposed to a certain extent, bracket off a la phenomenology, where you're coming from, but at least you're supposed to express it. And the idea here is that you should express where not only the context in which the work is done, but you as the instrument, the context of you and what your beliefs and thoughts are. And Kearney also goes on to say that they're actually about not trying to neutralize difference, not trying to bring things to a kind of homogeneous point, but to accept and acknowledge difference. So in the synthesis, the difference needs to be acknowledged. And certainly I think in Norbert Hare's first book, if I remember rightly, they did some of this work, where they came up with an initial theory based on their data, and then they found there were data that didn't fit. And so they went back and they extended the theory, again, like you would in grounded theory, to incorporate the data that didn't fit, and honoured those differences and acknowledged those differences. So back to the reflexivity, that without having personal reflexivity in the account, you can't actually understand the conditions in which what you find can be applied, or the conditions in which what you find has been created, more than anything else. So, for example, in an ongoing metasynthesis around freestanding birth centres that Dennis and I are doing, we've explicitly said that we think birth centres are a good thing, and that is an important point of departure for people who might not believe that when they come and look at how we've analysed our data. And in fact, in doing that, what we very explicitly did is we said, because we believe in it, we very explicitly looked for disproving data that does not demonstrate the value of birth centres, because that's the only way that we can really take into account our own personal belief sets. It's very hard to look at, that diagram, and that's for a reason. Thorns, this is another one of these authors. Now, they are interesting because they've got a slightly different take on the whole metasynthesis genre, in that they did work which they called meta-study, which was not only about looking at themes and synthesis and everything else, but also beginning to critique the underpinning philosophies of those who did those initial pieces of work. So they were actually looking at meta-theory, what they've also called meta-theory, across studies. And the reason why this diagram's there is that they had 292 studies, for goodness sake, 292 studies, that they looked at. And you can imagine, looking at qualitative data across 292 studies. And they said, unsurprisingly, truth claims of all sorts slipped into and out of focus. And certainly with our birth centre work, and we only had, I think, I've got it later, I think 4 studies, or maybe 5, 4 I think. In our birth study work, we found that there were certain truth claims around what midwives did that actually, when you looked at the data, weren't really backed up. And so we did find this phenomena. The paradox or the parallax is how they frame this. Okay, nice little turn of phrase. And then Sandalowski, lastly, talks, and I think this is so true, we live in an era of meta-madness, and she's also called it more recently meta-jeopardy. I think we really have to be careful about this. Let's put everything in a big bag and shake it all up and see what comes out the other end, and she's very strongly against this. And she separates out a number of turns of phrase, actually, but particularly meta-summary, which is basically quantitatively, and she does quite a lot of this, interestingly, with a qualitative researcher, quantitatively aggregating qualitative findings. So what they've done in some of their pieces of work is said, how often does this theme come up across a range of studies? Which I find a bit extraordinary, actually, because I think that's an unusual way to go about doing qualitative research. And then she goes on, she says that the metasynthesis is different. So and again, she's talking about integrating findings, the interpretive integration of qualitative findings that are themselves interpretations of the data, of course. So you're always getting one step away in each of these from the data. And she's very strong about this. In fact, this last paper, I think the whole paper could have been written in one paragraph, which is, do a metasynthesis. because she just repeats it over and over again for about 4 pages. And to a certain extent, I agree with her. You know, as we said earlier on, it's really important. She uses the phrase, come to a point. I must admit, I think I'd be a bit scared to be taught by Marguerite Sandalowski, but there you go. I think she's probably quite fierce. We met her. Yeah, well, there you go. I mean, this isn't, obviously, by any stretch of the imagination, a full summary of the kinds of studies, the number of studies that are out there. There are some of the studies that are relevant to us, potentially. Maybe not the chronic illness, but it's there because that's the one with the 292 studies in it. But you can see that it's probably only really since the late 90s, only the last 10 years, that these studies have started to come out in any kind of meaningful way. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the last two because I know about them, which is the two that one we've got published and one that's about to go out, and then a range of PhD students' work and some work we did for CMatch that I'll probably allude to. Which is not to say that these are the best, of course, but they're just the ones that I know about because we've done them. And if I'm going to guide you around knitting smoke, I have to tell you what we got up to, I suppose. The kinds of issues I think that come up that will be brought up as we go through this are these paradigmatic and philosophical, what topic, where you go with it, all these things. Some of which are the same for meta-analysis. I mean, I don't think we can deny that there's a synergy between the two, but some of them are different. So we'll go through some of these. So firstly, these questions. Again, the arguments against summing up. It's not about summing up, and I think that's really important. And any of you who've engaged with this will know that. Jensen talks about a search for truth value, which I think is a bit problematic because I mean, she's not talking about truth, I suppose. She's talking about truth value, and so I can kind of see that there's a bit of it's not quite the same as saying, you know, a be-all and answer. But still, I think using the term truth is a bit problematic. We might want to discuss that. The argument about whether you can combine studies that use different epistemological and methodological basis. Can you combine phenomenology with discourse analysis, for example? Can you combine grounded theory with ethnography? We think you can, but you know, I can also see why people might say you can't, because clearly if you're coming from a study that's about meanings, for example, around phenomenology, and combining it with about culture, you at least have to, as in ethnography, you at least have to acknowledge that those things are different phenomena. And they may tell you different things about the same topic, but they won't be able to tell you about the same areas. Can and should you be looking at the quality of the studies? So in the same way as you would for meta-analysis, where you look at the quality and then you combine high-quality studies, can you establish the quality of qualitative research? Should you? And again, there are debates about this. Sandalowski has produced a huge long checklist around the quality of qualitative studies, but then goes on to say, well, actually, it doesn't matter, you should use them all anyway, as long as they tell you something useful. Kind of interesting. Others would say you should never look at the quality of qualitative studies because there's so much argument about it, and as you'll see, it's true, there is argument. Role of self and reflexivity, again, I've discussed that a little bit. So let's go on to topic definition. Some of you may have seen me use this slide before. This is a llama birthing centre. And so, you know, if you're going to look at birth centres, how far do you go is the question really raised by that slide. And here's an example from our work around expertise. So we started off with this question. What's the nature of midwifery expertise in the context of physiological birth? That was the first thing that we were interested in. And then as we began doing this iterative process of searching and going back and forwards around what we could find, we ended up with a much more dense question. So what accounts of intrapartum midwifery skills, practices, beliefs and philosophies are given by practitioners working in the field of midwifery, not midwives? Because we began to realise that actually, and this is contentious, but the line between the trained midwife and the experienced and skilled traditional midwife is not necessarily clear. Or if it is clear, it may be clarified around issues of technical expertise and not necessarily around issues of belief and philosophy. So we extended it, and actually one of the journals we submitted this to wouldn't accept it for that reason. I won't say which one, because they thought it diluted the importance of midwives. And again, this was partly about our self-reflexivity. You know, we said to ourselves, actually, we want to find out about what the essence of, you know, from in a kind of phenomenological way, what's the essence of this thing called midwifery that matters to women beyond professionalisation, which is how we got to this point, really. Working in the field of midwifery who are practicing beyond the ordinary. And again, we started off talking about expertise, and we have used expertise as a shorthand. But again, when we started looking at the literature, terms like expertise, competence, experience are all used interchangeably. So we wanted to find out about people that were unusual in this area, in the intrapartum setting. So that's why the topic ended up becoming something different than it started off. that one is actually, that's a needle there in a haystack. So where and how to search. And clearly, again, I mean, it's difficult enough trying to find randomised trials, isn't it, if you've done meta-analysis. Trying to find qualitative accounts is well nigh impossible in any kind of meaningful way. And again, some authors in this field would say, there's no point in trying to find everything. Just find a range, and that'll do. Others, and again, we're in this camp, say, no, you really should try and find out as much as you can that's out there around your area, just to be rigorous, really, and to make sure you're not missing things that are not necessarily highlighted in the key journals, but which are important. And that may be looking in different disciplines as well as looking in different journals. So that the problem of missing something small is important. Equally, the problem of missing something huge is important, because sometimes a study can be staring you in the face and you don't pick it up because your search strategy has been too narrow. So balancing both of those things around searching is really important. Again, not different from meta-analysis, but different because you have to look in things like books, sometimes unpublished accounts, journals that you're not used to, and so on, to find some of these papers. Criteria, again, some of this is classic, your normal meta-analysis. What language do you look in? Now, generally, we've tended to only look in English because that's what we're able to do locally. We're just doing a search now, though, on following on from the CMATCH work, on why women in lower middle-income countries don't access antenatal care. And we are going to search for we're going to include French and Spanish literature in that because of French-speaking Africa and because of Latin America, because we think we're going to miss very important papers if we don't do that. Most of our other studies have been rather UK-centred, so it's been less important. The population group, I mean, again, this is similar to meta-analysis. What kind of population are you interested in? Are you going to make it narrow? So, for example, in terms of the antenatal work, our initial work was around women who don't access antenatal care at all, but we could have actually extended it to women who access and then don't continue to access, for example. So, that's fairly important to establish. And again, some would argue that you set that very broadly because you never quite know what you're going to find. And others would say that makes it unmanageable. It's the same kind of argument as for meta-analysis. It's a pragmatic decision. There's no right or wrong answer as long as you can justify it. That's the important thing. The setting, and again, our birth centre study, we found that quite difficult. Not so much for the qualitative one. Yeah, we did actually for both, for our quantitative and our qualitative one. Because when we started looking at American birth centres, a lot of them had GPs and obstetricians in attendance in the birth centre. So we started to say, well, are we interested in the relationship between the midwife and the woman and midwife-led care? Are we interested in out-of-hospital birthing? Or are we interested in a combination of both of those things? So those kind of questions begin to come up when you start looking at setting and what goes on in settings. Again, these are the contextual questions. Are you conscious of the context and how that might vary? Even though they're all called birth centres, they're not all the same thing. What type of study we've already discussed? Are you going to just look at ethnographies? Are you going to look at a range? Are you going to include high quality studies or not? And this is important, I think. How close to the data do you want to get? And again, this depends on whether you take the line that you're interpreting an interpretation, so that what metasynthesis is about a sociological construction based on somebody else's sets of constructions. Or are you saying, no, I actually want to find out from the raw data what was said and reanalyse the data? I must say, we've tended to do that. We've tended to go back as far as we can because, of course, even the raw data isn't raw. It's a construction of the interviewer or the observer and the practice. But at least it's not reduced into journal form. So it's a PhD thesis, for example. When I talk about raw data, I don't mean the transcripts. I mean a PhD thesis rather than a journal article. Because although it's still interpretation, you've got a much broader canvas to take that interpretation from than you have from the constraints of a journal. And you're also more likely to find the reflexivity and the contextual issues and all those kind of things. So we to date, have tried to go back to the original report or PhD thesis. I'm still not sure whether that's right or not. I don't know. And we could debate it. Date range, again, people tend to be quite arbitrary about this. Oh, I'll look back to 1980, that'll do. Or, 1960, because that's when Medline began, Not really good enough. You have to have a rationale for why you went back to 1980. Was it pre-training childbirth? Did things happen differently before and after, for example? Otherwise, again, it's a bit arbitrary, really, and you could be missing something really important. Or you could be doing far too much. It's equally as bad to do too much as too little, because you could be wasting taxpayers' money if you're spending a lot of time on something that wasn't necessary. Study quality, and again, I'm going to go into that in a bit more detail. And also, what about opinion? I mean, we've started to talk about, we've done but not had published what we've called a nested narrative review, where we've did some work, Sheena Byram did this for her master's dissertation, did a metasynthesis and then looked at opinion data around what she found. She was kind of trying to see whether what she found from metasynthesis was reflected in current opinion, to see whether that was kind of made sense. And we haven't taken that any further, but you know, it's up for debate, I think. Okay, so here's an example from our expertise study, or practicing beyond the ordinary study, which was done by myself, Louise Simpson and Katrina Trafford. And Louise has now taken us forward and done a Master's by Research building on this work, and she's now planning some cross-cultural work for her PhD. So this is kind of, you know, moving on quite nicely, really. Published in Jan a couple of years, this year, in fact. So we did have very clear exclusion criteria, and you can see them here. We couldn't deal with non-English studies, and that may be a critique of this, because you know, clearly there may be some very interesting work in Spanish, particularly. So we might have to go back and look at that again, if we can find a Spanish speaker to help us. As it happens, we've got one now, so that's good. We didn't include opinion. We have got it. We did search for it, but we didn't include it in the final piece of work because it just was too big. Obviously not quantitative data. Obviously, where the participants, we wanted participants who are maternity care practitioners. We specifically wanted studies where the participants were seen as experts or exemplary, in Holly Kennedy's words. So we wanted that group. And what we didn't include was studies that were focused on a priori, where they'd already anticipated what they were going to find, like intuition or von Toos practitioners. Particular kinds of expertise we didn't include, because we were looking for a broad sweep around what the thing called expertise is. We didn't want it predetermined for us, so we didn't include them. And we wanted good quality papers, so we didn't include studies where there wasn't enough information about the quality. I'll come back to that later. So then the next question is, how many studies? Now, we've certainly had a paper turned down because there were too few studies in it. On the other hand, there are papers like Russell with only 3 studies in them that have been published. And then there's the Patterson one of 292. You know, I really think there's a debate around the number. I don't think there's any clear. I can't in the literature see anywhere that's definitive about whether 4 or 204 is the right number. Probably somewhere in the middle is. Only because this is birds flocking, this picture. So, okay, get lots of studies, and you probably can see a pattern around the birds flocking, but what you can't see is the detail, because there's just too many. So, you know, obviously, if you've got fewer studies, then you can pick up more of the detail that might be in there. So, I'm still inclined to think, my view on this is sufficient is how many are turned up by your search. That's how many there is, that's how many you include. And I still feel that. And if you've got 292, your search is too big. But, you know, that's a very particular view, obviously. Which data to include, and again, we've kind of come across that again. Obviously, you can't, if you're looking at PhD theses, if that's the plural, thesum, no, anyway, you're not going to include the whole thing. So which ones are you going to include? And to a certain extent, it's useful to go back to Noblet and Hare to look at that. So you, as we said, you can include the original researchers' interpretations. We've kind of discussed this a bit already, from the published data or the original thesis. Or actually the raw data, and we've not done that, but there is a debate about that. Do you go back to the transcripts? Can you? Should you? Who is the instrument? Now, what's interesting is that there was one paper, and I was trying to find this actually, I can't find it. If you've looked at this, you might know it yourselves, but there was one paper, and I'm pretty sure it was one with Sandalowski, or it might have been Cheryl Beck, one of Cheryl Beck's papers, where the authors were the authors of the original studies. So they got together to look at all their own studies in the group, each other's on their own, with the argument that because they are the instrument of the research, it makes sense that they are involved then in the metasynthesis, in the next level, if you like, of the research. And that's interesting. I've not seen it done since, but I think it's an interesting question. And maybe one of the things that we might want to say in future is that each metasynthesis will involve at least one author from the papers that are being included, so that they can actually explain how they reached that conclusion in the first place. Can you do participant triangulation? And by the participant here, I mean the researchers, the original researchers. So if you don't do that, if you don't involve the researchers, could you send your interpretations to the original researchers and say, does this ring true for you in the light of your original studies? We haven't done that, but I think, again, it's quite, and I'm not seeing it written about, but it could be quite interesting to do. And, you know, again, you can't go back to the original participants, probably, but that may be the best place to go. And again, going back to which data, this is the freestanding review that we're still in the middle of completing, which has got 4 studies. So we could get hold of 2 theses and 3 published papers that were around, in total, 4 studies. So quality criteria, this is a statement from Murphy, who was asked to review the quality criteria that are out there by the HTA. And they take the line that we really should have quality criteria. So, if the findings of research cannot be taken to represent even an approximation of the truth, why should commissioners fund such research? I think that's a really good question. So I'm convinced of the need to look for quality, but you will find, and you will, if you're writing about this methodologically in a research paper or a thesis, you need to reflect the fact that this is not necessarily the standard. Well, it probably is becoming a standard view, but it isn't a universal view. So, well, this is our statement, so you can see where we're coming from. If you've got methodologically flawed studies, you're going to get a bad metasynthesis, we think. And again, this is arguable, and you can argue with me about it. But the question is, who decides what's good quality? And I mean, any of you who've dived into qualitative research will know this is a very active debate. In our paper, we looked at what was out there already in terms of quality. This was in the process of doing the freestanding birth centre work. We had to go back to this and do this piece of work because we couldn't find a good checklist. So we found 8 checklists and summary frameworks. One of those papers actually included 29 other different checklists. So one of the 8 itself was a synthesis of 29 checklists. So you can see this has been bandied about for, amongst people for a long time, and there's all kinds of debates around it. And we added another checklist to that whole bunch, which was kind of between the very simplistic ones, like the CASP have got a very simple, the critical appraisal group have got a very simple checklist, which we do use, and then the one with, Sandalowski's one that runs to about 10 pages. We went somewhere in between that. So these are the kind of things that we look for when we do our checks, that the scope and purpose is defined, that there is a theoretical perspective identified, that the design is coherent with the perspective, that's stated, and that all these things are coherent with each other, really, from the start to the end. So it's basically providing something which you can be fairly convinced of, that is robust, transparent, and it's ethically clear, and relevance and transferability is expressed. So that's what we look for. Now, we don't say that if you don't tick all those boxes, we're not going to include a study. And you'll see the other thing that we've gone on to do, which again is even more contentious, is to have a summary score, summary quality score, which I've not seen in any other papers, papers around this area. Not necessarily to say that we will throw things out that are lower down the score level, but so that people can understand the quality of the studies that we've actually brought into play. Oh, here it is. There you go. This is based on some work that Elaine Jackson, another one of our master's students, did. So she started this work, and then we've taken it forward since then. And it's now in the expertise paper, in fact, is the first time it was published. So it's very simple, and it's based on Lincoln and Guba's definition of the quality of qualitative research. So no or few flaws, that the study is credible, transferable, dependable, confirmable, which is Lincoln and Guba's criteria. B, some flaws, but they're really unlikely to affect the transferability of the study. So A's and B's we would definitely include in anything that we do. C's we might not, and D's we don't. So C is some flaws which might affect the credibility of the work, and D is significantly flawed piece of work. And that might be not necessarily the work itself was flawed, but that we can't find the data to be sure that it isn't. So some studies might fall into D that are very good studies, but we can't find the evidence they're good studies. And I'll hopefully show you, if I can get onto the thing here, how we've done it in practice. So what we normally do for ourselves or for our students is advise that the first cut, if you like, is the CASP. For those of you who haven't come across it, it's available online. The CASP approach, which is very simple to qualitative research. So if they don't fit the CASP criteria, then we don't include the papers at all. If they get through that gate, then we apply our more detailed one to the studies, and then the summary quality score. Now, probably if they've got through the CASP gate, they're going to be A or B on our score anyway. But we do it just so we can have a sense of where they fit in the spectrum. And again, I'm going to show you some examples now. But once we've defined which studies are in based on those criteria, then in the same way we do it for meta-analysis, we map the characteristics of the study. So again, people are clear what study looks like. And the Epicenter, which mainly deals with educational research, run by Anne Oakley, has got a lot of tools around how you map studies. So it might be worth looking at that if anybody's interested. Now I'm going to try and see, hopefully we'll be able to, if I can show you a kind of in vivo example of some of these things. This is the CMATCH study, some work we did for CMATCH, as I mentioned earlier on, which was a combination of quantitative and qualitative research. And it was Tina Lavender, and Dennis did the quantitative aspect, and myself and Kenny Finlayson did the qualitative aspect around why high-risk women don't access antenatal care in high-income countries, which is the study before the one we're doing now. So we're just writing it up now, and I can show you some of what we actually did. So let's go to this is a quality score. So this is the table we used to establish the quality. And the levels refer to, these aren't all the included studies, so they are. Level 1 studies were UK studies, and level 2 were UK-like settings, high-income settings studies, and we included both of those. And then just went through, these are the codes from the original search, and then we went through whether they actually fitted these criteria that we'd set up or not. And we did that independently of each other. So 2 of us did it independently and then came together and saw if we agreed with it or not. And then you can see the quality rating at the bottom. So we allowed some flexibility between categories. But basically, we did include all of these, even though that's a BC, because we felt it was actually not, the problem really was that it started off very closed. So there was a certain amount of directionalness that was built into it. But in the end, we thought it probably was worth including it. So a lot of this is actually, it's not fixed. It is actually, again, iterative, as I said to you before. So having gone through all that and decided what was in, so let's just flick through all these. This is at the full text stage. This is the mapping of the study itself. So these are the characteristics of the studies that are all mapped. So that you can actually see, for example, grounded theory. This is an interesting one. Naturalistic approach from a naive, atheoretical stance based on grounded theory. Wow. Symbolic interactionism and participatory research. So a big mix, as you can see, of different studies. I mean, that's not all of them, but that were included. So we obviously take the view that we can mix this range of studies up, but at least if you are clear about what's in them, then people can judge, whether or not they also agree with that or not. So having done that mapping stage, characteristics stage, and of course the problem then arises about how much this gets published, because most journals won't publish all this. Sorry, that's after quality review. I'm just trying to find the data. I think the data are higher up. Yeah. It's easy. I'll find it for you in just a minute. To show you, to a certain extent, and there's a bit more of this later on, about how we brought those things together. Now, I'll show you this now, actually, but this is a synthesis, in fact, so I'm jumping around a bit. But we synthesised all that we found into these 2 areas. So first of all, that initial access to antenatal care is influenced by pregnancy rejection or acceptance and personal capacity or incapacity. And then once people had access care, continued access was influenced more strongly by this balance between gains and losses. If I can find it again. So it's a bit jumpy, this mouse. It's a bit like the clutch on my car, a bit skippy. There it is. Yeah. So gains and perceived benefits versus perceived losses was what's come out of it. Now again, this is very contingent and it's up for debate and for change, but this is where we've got to with this particular study so far. And it gives you a bit of a flavour for what a synthesis might look like. That's not a line of argument synthesis, though. It's just a general synthesis, and I'll show you where we're at with the line of argument synthesis next, or soon, at least. Get on to the thing. Which one was I on? Can't remember. It's beyond that, wasn't it? Let's go there. Oh yeah, perfect. Okay, so moving on from all that then. So who should be the analyst? So having decided that we've got this far, and now you've got to decide on your analytic strategy and who's going to do the analysis. Is it going to be one individual? Are you going to do it with a team, like we tend to do? Are you going to do it blind? Are you going to do it by consensus? How are these things going to emerge from the process? And using Noblet and Hare's line, this is the kind of, again, the one that's classically used, and certainly the one that we use. The way to do it is to read the studies, obviously, determine how they're related, and this is where the reciprocal and refutational translation comes in. Translate them from one to the next. And then synthesize them through the line of argument. So the process is, again, not so different from meta-analysis, except for this idea of looking for disconfirming data around the refutational analysis and coming up with a synthesis, and then expressing the synthesis and how it's expressed. And one way is the way I've just shown you. Another way to do the process is this one. So this is schematically how it's done. And again, it's a fairly grounded theory approach. So you start with the first study, and then you derive key themes from the first one, and then you take those into the second study and see if it fits, and if it doesn't, then you amend the themes, take it into the third one, and so on. Now, I must say, we tend to not do that. We tend to put them all together and do it as a whole. But classically, this is what would happen if you took a kind of Glazner, a Noblet and Hare a la grounded theory approach, a la Glazner and Strauss approach. And this is an example of some work that we did. This is the expertise study again. So you can see about the evolution of this. Louise and Katrina came up with the first list of what they thought was in the studies they'd included. Then they and I got together and we looked at possible refutation. This is reciprocal. We looked at both how it was reciprocal but also how it was possibly refutational. We found these things, role changes in profession, didn't fit anywhere with our reciprocal translation. So we had these things that were outstanding that weren't fitting in with the theory somehow. And we ended up with these three themes. If you like, this was a thematic analysis at this stage that expressed all of this but didn't account for this bit here. So we ended up with this kind of refutational bit stuck on at the end, really, which was that you've got this expertise, whatever it is, but it's contingent on the context of childbirth. How it's expressed is contingent on the context of childbirth. In fact, interestingly, following the focus group work that Louise has just done, what she's found is that actually expert midwives are not affected by the context, they affect the context. They are the people that make the context different. So we've moved on from this now a little bit. But anyway, in the studies that were existing at the time, it looked like expertise was affected by context. So our looking for the patterns, and again, this is a Mandelbrot diagram for the complexity theorist amongst us, but looking for the patterns in it, looking for the line of argument, we came up with this synthesis, and I'll just read it. So as the practitioners in the studies in our review became more expert, they appeared to revalue and to express qualities such as trust, belief, and courage. So having come into midwifery with those kind of beliefs, had them knocked out of them, they seemed to re-express them as they got more confident. To be more willing to act on intuitive gestalt insights and to prioritise connected relationships over displays of technical brilliance. So although they were technically brilliant, they didn't have to show it necessarily. In some of the accounts, the enactment of vocation led these experts to move outside of, and this is the refutational bit, outside of and beyond normative childbirth practices, so to become more exposed to critique. So what our line of arguments try to do is take account of that reciprocal element of the context. And that, I think, is what's meant by line of argument, at least that's how we understand it. It takes account in a contingent way of what's come out of what's gone before. Just as another example, this is the birth centres review, where we've combined the reciprocal and refutational together. So in this case, Dennis and I both came up with these lists independently of each other, having got the studies together. And then we again we did a bit of reflexivity and said, okay, we want to find normality here, so are we finding it because we want to find it, in fact? And we started to look at the refutational, the disconfirming data. So we came up with something actually much less flattering to birth centres, in fact, which I think is why, well, it's not been very acceptable to many people that the kind of normality practice in birth centres is contingent on the environment. And the particular example that we give is one of the American birth centres, and this is around the creating deviance thing, where one of the women wanted her child, now I always say castrated here, I don't mean castrated, circumcised, wants her child circumcised, and but the midwives treated it as if she was asking for castration. They were really, they expressed a great deal, this is an ethnographic study, so it was clear in observation, a great deal of condemnation of this woman because she was practicing outside, she was deviant from what was the normality contingent on that environment, yeah? So this interpretation of birth centres is not actually straightforwardly flattering. And so we say, and this is built on Annandale. Annandale is one of the people that's in the study, and her work strongly influences this line of argument. So the reality of the freestanding birth centres was constructed in a complex interplay between social action, this is Annandale's words, social action, social relationships, and social structure. And then we said, midwives managed the culture of freestanding birth centres in certain ways to accommodate the interface between their philosophy, the philosophy of obstetricians, and usually, but not always, that of labouring women and their partners. Because there's a certain midwifery project going on around birth centres, which doesn't necessarily engage women all the time, necessarily. And it's still unpublished because people don't like it, but it will be published. So the rules of thumb around here are, obviously the process is iterative, that's important. It's never final, it's contingent. And one of the measures of quality is fit and transferability. So, you know, if people, I mean, hopefully if you've read those lines of argument and gone, oh yeah, I recognise that, then for us that's fit. You know, that it actually makes sense with your frames of reference, and you know, you can see it could be transferred to other kinds of environments. So that would be a tick for us. And you know, we certainly feel this. The concepts of theoretical saturation and disconfirmation are useful. So again, when I say the number of studies is the number of studies that arises from your search, equally, if you do find a lot of studies in your search, then you're probably looking to find saturation. So in that case, I probably would do the first study, then the second study, then the third study, and then when you get to the 10th, hopefully you've got some degree of saturation, so you might not have to go on to your 50th, hopefully. So finally, how should the findings be reported? I mean, do you report that whole process? Do you publish all those tables that I've just shown you? Obviously you can't, because most journals won't accept them. So there is and we've certainly struggled with this, trying to fit all this stuff into, well, most recently a paper for the BMJ, which is, 3,000 words. How did you do that? And although some of these papers, some of these journals will allow you to put things on their electronic site, so you can put some of the data on the electronic site, you obviously can't always. So we're still kind of struggling with how much space is given to reflexivity, all that kind of thing, which we think is important. And that's just a question of trial and error, I think, and seeing how you can get it to fit into the framework of the journals that you're reporting it to. But it seems to me still kind of, if you like, paradigmatically for me, that those elements of reflexivity and of quality and those things that we've just talked about in our checklist should be there. Even if they're only there as a line, they should be there somewhere, just to acknowledge that they were done. So this is actually called a smoke ring, and as I understand it. So this is knitted smoke here, if you like. And clearly it could have been knitted into anything, something different could have been made. But if you can knit something that at least has some form that can be transferred from one person to the next, then it's something hopefully that's useful and meaningful. In this case, probably keeps you warm as well. So it has some kind of utility. And obviously at the end of the day, what we're all about is utility, making a difference. And if it doesn't make a difference, if it's just an esoteric exercise that gives you a tick on your CV and on the RAE, then I would say it's a failure. Academic success, but a failure in terms of changing the world, if you like. So just to kind of wrap up a few slides on where the future of this might be. And again, this is this 2004 paper, which I would recommend looking at because it does summarise a lot of the key arguments from a lot of the key writers in this field. And as you can see, they're basically saying the methodological conventions remain in flux. So almost nothing I've told you is correct. It's kind of like hopefully correct enough, but it's not necessarily correct, and it might be different in a year's time. The kinds of innovations I mentioned briefly that are beginning to come on stream, which aren't necessarily about metasynthesis, but they're in this whole area of contingency, I suppose, is critical realist review. And if you're interested in that, then Paulson is the guy to look for. Tricia Greenhog's also done some work in this area. And basically the mantra there is what works, for who, in what context. So rather than here's a simple intervention, a large trial of a simple intervention, that might not work somewhere else. What they're much more interested in is that question, what works, for who, and where. And that's increasingly been taken up. There's lots more papers written about it. It's a lot more acknowledged by government. And I think metasynthesis fits into that paradigm really quite well. Mixed methods review, so that's not phenomenology and so on. It's about quantitative and qualitative, and things that aren't called either. I'm bringing all those things in together, and that also fits with critical realism, because they're using the lines of argument technique can be used across a whole range of qualitative and quantitative studies. And then this business about including opinion is under debate, because that may help us to understand the context in which these studies are situated. And I'm sure there's lots more, but those are just the things that kind of sprung up for me at the moment. Narrative research is obviously part of all that too, comes into play with all that. And I want to finish with a couple of slides that kind of illustrate the fact that I think people have felt very marginalised around doing this kind of research, but I think it's increasingly mainstream. First of all, I want to say that, I don't know if you know, but the evidence-based medicine, which I think has been a real bugbear for many of us around its kind of absolutism. When you look at what Sackett and Guy, David Sackett particularly, originally wrote about evidence-based medicine, it was best evidence against practitioner skills and patient values. That is, what works, for who, in what context, was what evidence-based medicine was always supposed to be about. It wasn't supposed to be about, here's a guideline that's really a protocol, and if you don't follow it, then you're going to be hung and drawn and quartered. It was really about, let's find what we know best, and let's see how it works with what you can do in your particular context. And interestingly, Murray Enkin, who is one of the kind of leaders around evidence-based medicine, particularly in maternity care and in the Cochrane Review, I came across this lovely quote the other day. I'll let you just read that bit. So he's beginning to move into this paradigm of uncertainty and complexity and recognise that, really, this is where things are at. And he says, it is, to use an ancient word I only recently learned, a clinamen, a swerve, a point of intellectual revision. And I think probably, we're kind of entering this. He set up something called the Clinamen Corporation, I think, or Institute, to incorporate, to kind of follow on from Cochrane, if you like, to incorporate some of these things. And I want to finish with I hope this is going to work on the sound. This is Donna Rumsfeld, and some of you would have seen this. I've used it before, and you may have seen it in a different context. But just to illustrate this whole point, really.
The message is that there are known knowns. There are things we know that we know. There are known unknowns. That is to say, there are things that we now know we don't know. But there are also unknown unknowns. There are things we do not know we don't know. And each year we discover a few more of those unknown unknowns.
Okay, thank you very much. Questions?